Today we're going to talk about Zora Neale Hurston's The Gilded Six Bits, and there's something about this story that I like so much. The warmth of the writing, the way it's written, the way the characters act with one another. It just seems warm in a way in which really appeals to me, and I really like the story in general. The writing is just it's just beautiful in my opinion. But let's talk about some serious critiques of the story itself. And this story is a very interesting story to think about in a few different ways. The first way I'd like to talk about is this idea of feminist criticism. Okay, so what is feminist criticism? Well, first of all, let's define criticism. Criticism is not to criticize or to, in the form of tear something down, or that it is criticism in this sense. Literary criticism is meant to kind of extract a deeper meaning, or just to produce something more powerful from the work through interrogation. And so criticism is really, it's kind of an adjunct to the work itself. It's not to tear it down. So feminist criticism of this book, and obviously feminist criticism is going to be dealing with women's issues as they relate to kind of a social context, and specifically through literature. And here we see quite a few feminist critiques of the work that talk about the relationship between Missy and Joe and Otis. So one of the main criticisms is that we see Missy kind of taking out, she's taking up this idea of this feminine archetype that has been really questioned by a lot of scholars. And so what it is that and then again, I'm really kind of paraphrasing, and I'm putting this, I'm using broad strokes here because we don't have enough time to go into the very, very deep field of feminist criticism in its entirety. But one of the main critiques here is that Missy's taking up this feminine archetype of this woman who is subservient to her husband, right? That Joe makes the money, she does not. She works in the house, cleans the house, and that is kind of her main value. And then she kind of enjoys this, and that she just plays this a very traditional role. And I think this is something we kind of all understand. I mean, you can look back at sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver, and I think it's very common. We all understand this, right? This idea of homemaker, man goes out in the world, makes the money. She's kind of the second person in the marriage, and that the husband leads. And so that has been a lot of the critique about the story itself. Joe is the person who makes the money. He is the person who obviously in the story kind of guides the relationship through that capacity, and that even though he loves her, that there's this kind of relationship of dependence, right? So if Joe was to leave, he would still have a job. He could still support himself. What would happen to Missy? She does not have a job. She would be left somewhat destitute, or in a much more difficult position than Joe would. So she is obviously at a disadvantage as far as power goes about kind of exiting or I guess moving within or out of this relationship in a way in which Joe has this kind of privilege that he could do that a little bit easier if he wanted to. So really interesting kind of feminist critiques of this story say that what we see here is we see the feminine archetype in Missy. We see that model moving towards this idea of independence or of freedom. And how is she moving toward this idea of independence or freedom? That it's the affair with Otis, right? And the affair with Otis is this kind of theoretical move by this archetype, right, away from this model of dependence within this kind of male-dominated relationship of her marriage, toward these kind of thinking about or feeling towards this other model or this other way of gaining power. And in this way it's through sexuality, right? She's using sexuality, and after she's confronted with the affair, she says, "I'm sorry, Joe, he kept promising me he was going to give me the money, these gold coins," and so the character states that she's doing it not. I mean, it's not that it's just for the money. I'm not saying that she's a complete prostitute, which she has been called by some feminist critics, that she's prostituting herself, and in a way, in a positive way, I guess, moving towards using that sexuality as a means, as a move towards independence, away from the male-dominated archetype that we're kind of familiar with. And so we see her travel to the brink of this independence and then pull back. And in the way the story's been criticized in the derogatory sense, by saying that the character could have used this stepping stone to move outside this model of dependence in the marriage and move towards kind of a new model, right? To use her sexuality to kind of continue this journey away from this model of dependence. And so that is kind of a traditional feminist critique of the story. And so let's counterpoint that with this idea of like a post-colonial critique. And so post-colonial critique is critiquing stories in the light of this kind of recognition of a colonial domination. Here we're speaking in obviously through like the American form of domination through slavery. So a white dominated society over the subservient black role. And then so here we see this model played out at the very first line of the story. I'll read it very clearly here. States that it was a Negro yard around a Negro house in a Negro settlement that looked to the payroll of the G&G Fertilizer Works for its support. So we have this model of dependence, right, that is very common, that the people that live in this community, the black people that live in this community, are completely dependent upon this fertilizer company, presumably owned by white people. Why would they take the time to point out the Negro settlement and so on and so forth, if not to counterpoint that with the fertilizer factory that was obviously owned by a white dominated family, or we could read into it that way. You could make other arguments as well. But so within this kind of context that we see both Joe and Missy and Otis all playing this kind of subservient role to this kind of larger societal body in which they belong, right? That Joe himself is also he is still a servant to this larger system. Missy is still, in the feminist critique, is a servant within this familial system or the husband-dominated system. Joe is a servant within this kind of larger societal system. And then, so maybe we could look and see Otis as this kind of a character that is representing this new way, beyond this kind of stereotypical domination, and maybe also rehearsing it as well, right? So he seems to be moving further away from this kind of dominated system. He seems to have a certain amount of wealth, and he seems to be a kind of gregarious guy that is moving beyond a role of subservience, that he's boisterous and worldly, and he's definitely very different than Joe. And Joe even plainly states this in many cases and envies him for it. So what kind of models does that create for us? And what kind of problematics does that establish, right? Because within this model, then we have Joe seeking to break away from this model of dependence, right? He wishes he had gold. He had a mouthful of gold teeth. He had a $10 gold fob on his I believe it was his watch fob. I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up a little bit now. But he wants for this gold and this idea of personal wealth that would give him this independence that would no longer make him reliant on this system of domination like we just talked about. So using that, can we not see both, at the very minimum, can we not see Joe and Missy both as subservient in this dominant model, and both seeking to break out of this subservience through kind of participating in what Otis represents, this alternate model to what they are living in. And then at the very end of the story, when we see that this model that Otis represents has become a falsehood, right? That he has used his, kind of alternate model to, corrupt their marriage, and also that his model also it's a falsehood, right? That the gold is not really gold, and it's just plated, and it's not real, and so that model itself seems to disappear, and that Joe and Missy return to this model of subservience to a dominant class, in this case the white owners of the fertilizer factory. And so what does that say about the story? Does that say that the story is simply rehearsing this idea of domination as something that is positive? And then is that a problem? And so these are two different kinds of models of kind of theoretical discussion of the stories that I find like very interesting. Beyond that, there's a lot more stuff like character study. So it's really, the character study in this is so complex and so deep, right? This idea of Joe, we would see Joe as like a hulking guy, and possibly this, you would want to normally kind of see him as wanting to be a brute, but yet when confronted with the, right there in the bedroom with a man and his wife, that he does virtually nothing. He punches Otis one time, then makes him leave. He goes on to eventually, forgive this, his wife, and to seemingly everything seems to be going back to normal. And then, what is the character study of Missy May? And that she seems to really love Joe, and that at the same time that she acts outside of her marriage, and is this just a simple kind of singular instance, or a larger kind of study of her personality as a whole, so on and so forth. But I think that kind of traditional character study is much more understood by students at your level. And so if there's any other questions about the story, if there's any other kind of comments that you would like to leave, just let me know, and then we can talk about anything else you'd like to. All right, well, I will record another video, and see you very soon.